Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 1 million times worldwide and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country.
In today's episode 294, we catch up with hiker Katrina Hemingway to talk about her experience on the Pacific Crest Trail and, along with her hiking partner, having to manage type 1 diabetes. We hope you enjoy. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. In the past, we have interviewed hikers who have walked the Pacific Crest Trail in the US. And while everyone's experiences are different, Australia Katrina Hemingway has her own story to tell. When Katrina undertook her journey with British hiking partner Helen, apart from being older hikers, they were both having to manage their type 1 diabetes, which added an extra degree of complexity to their planning and management of this hike. Katrina, it's our pleasure to talk to you about your journey on the Pacific Crest Trail and the challenges that this walk presented.
Thank you so much, Tim. I can't wait to tell you all about it.
Before we talk about your trip on the Pacific Crest Trail, tell us a bit about yourself, your general background and your hiking.
General background, pretty ordinary life. I guess I wanted to tell you about my love for hiking and how it started with my type 1 diabetes diagnosis when I was in my second pregnancy. So I was believed that a viral trigger caused me to develop diabetes, and the pregnant state just brought it on sooner rather than later. And really the only way I could control my blood glucose levels, apart from injecting large doses of insulin, was to stay active and keep healthy. And so I played a lot of sport at school, tennis, cricket, swimming, and I maintained an interest in softball seriously for 25 years. I'm the eldest of 3 girls, and my middle sister represented Australia in cricket. So we were quite a sporting family. But despite all of that, the activity I enjoyed most, cost little and was easy to do, was walking, preferably in the bush. And I felt happiest when I was away from the traffic and the crowds. And so since my diagnosis, I started doing short walks close to the local bushland. I lived on the North Shore in Sydney and backed onto Lane Cove National Park. And then I moved further afield and I started walking with a friend regularly. She lost her beloved husband tragically, and I suggested let's do a challenging walk such as Kokoda, for example. And everybody poo-pooed us. We really had no hiking experience. But after 18 months of quite diligent practice, going up and down steep hills in our local area, we undertook Kokoda in 2008 in July in Papua New Guinea's winter, so still very, very humid, and managed to raise $30,000 for MS research.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, so the reason for that was that my husband has this disease, has had it for over 20 years now, hence why I chose that charity. Not that, diabetes is important, but I felt my quality of life was so much better. So we were my friend and I were pretty new to long-distance hiking. And, although Kokoda, it's only about 96 kilometres, it's up there with one of the toughest. And we paid porters to carry our load, so we weren't stupid at the time. We packed very inefficiently, I guess, because they're carrying our load and paying them to do it. We could pack as much as we liked, but, and unnecessary luxury items and the like. But we had day packs with us, and the excess was left to the porters. And so it was a tough entry into multi-day hikes, but it didn't squash our enthusiasm. And as my husband's disease progressed, I was inspired to try creating fundraising walks for those living with MS, and not for them to actually do the walks, but for us to raise the funds so that their quality of life would be improved. And this involved me designing 2 significant fundraising walks. The first was 210 kilometres in distance, and I was looking for a town that started with M for multiple and then ending with S for sclerosis, and so Sydney was the foregone conclusion for the end of the walk, but I chose Mudgee in regional New South Wales as the starting point. And so 210 kilometres in distance took us 11 days, and I got many people to join us at various sections of the walk, particularly when I had access off-road to some of the bushwalks in the Blue Mountains. So I decided to go through.
Now, is that a designated walk, or is this something you just put together?
It's something we put together. It took us many, many months. We did a traffic management plan, which we had to submit to the New South Wales Police, and it was so concise. It was hundreds of pages full of photographs that they asked us to abbreviate it, and we never actually got their approval. Another group did something similar. They were called Nuns on the Run from another country town. So we used their model, and we were really confident that what we had done was so thorough. So if there were very dangerous verges on the highway that were not safe for us to walk on, even though we had visibility vests on, we were put in the support vehicle for maybe a couple of kilometres, and then we got out and continued walking again. So we ended up walking through the Blue Mountains, and we ended that walk at MS Research's Chatswood office in September 2010.
I was going to say, now I believe you've also done some other longer walks as well, some well-known international walks.
Yeah, so I then came up with the idea, what if I can encourage some people? I was putting it out. It wasn't just to my friends. What about walking across the country? And I knew about Wainwright's Coast to Coast in the UK. So I did a bit more research on that, and then did more planning, and then I encouraged people to join me. And because I didn't want to just get people who were going to piggyback off my efforts and were not committed to the cause of raising money for MS, I said that they needed to fundraise $10,000 individually, and they had to fund their own travel and their accommodation expenses. So that probably put paid to a lot of people being interested in doing that. But I ended up getting about 25 people walking across, and 16, 17 of those came from Australia. And I think all but one of them raised the $10,000. The Mudgee to Sydney walk and Wainwright's Coast to Coast, we jointly raised over $400,000 for MS research. And then in 2018, I did a quick 430 Ks with my sister and brother-in-law. And we walked the Pennine Way from Midlands, UK to Scotland. So, yeah, they were the most challenging walks I had done, but I really enjoyed them. And it was involving organising other people. I do like logistics. And then I thought, well, how about doing 10 times that last distance? And so began my interest in walking the Pacific Crest Trail.
All right, so that takes us on to the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, you've got an online book, and we'll actually put the link to that in the show notes if people want to read it. And I must admit, there's a lot of books out about hiking. I actually quite like your style, so it was an enjoyable read. So I think people will enjoy having a look at it, and particularly if they're interested in doing this walk.
Yes, and that's what I aim to do as well, because as you said, there are a lot of books of that style, but it was really about two strangers who met online and how we managed to do as much as we did.
From the time you discovered the Pacific Crest Trail until you started walking was only 6 months. Now, while that might sound like a lot of preparation time for many hikers, as you said, you're talking about just over 4,300 kilometres. So tell us what lay behind your trip decisions and why the quick turnaround for wanting to get on the trail in the shortest time as you did.
All right, so my last job was a sales rep for HarperCollins Publishers, and my job was to sell a multitude of titles each month to small independent booksellers over the phone. And I had to do a lot of research. There were lead titles that I was expected to push, but I personally liked inspiring non-narrative fiction. You know, those stories that showcase brave individuals prepared to think outside the box and dare to dream. And then I often spoke of those titles to my booksellers, and for those who thought those books may interest their readers. And then as I caught the train one morning and preparing to research the next month's listings I had to sell in, I suddenly had a moment of clarity, and I thought to myself, hey, I'm bored. I want to do something epic. I quickly Googled the best long-distance hike in the world, and it came up with the answer PCT. I didn't even know what it stood for. You've said it correctly, Pacific Crest Trail, but most people call it Pacific Coast Trail. So I had to do more research, and I thought, 4,300 kilometres, that's a very long way. And I thought, oh, this is so exciting. I really, really, really want to do it. Went to work, got sidetracked with my work objectives, and then I went out to lunch, and I thought, hang on a minute, you're just being a little bit impetuous here. Can a type 1 diabetic do this walk? You know, what are the resupply issues? How do I store my insulin safely? You know, am I just being a little bit presumptive here that this is possible? So I Googled again PCT and type 1 diabetes, and I came up with a link to the Frio website in the UK. And Frio have invented, you're probably familiar with those cooling neckties that have got gel beads in them that you wet and they make you feel cooler. So Frio have cooling wallets for temperature-sensitive medications, such as insulin, so that when you're in the desert and it's 37 degrees plus and your insulin is likely to spoil, you just wet these wallets and you insert your insulin inside the wallet, and it maintains it at room temperature for 48 hours before you have to wet it again. And then deep in the bowels of that website was an article about a woman who was attempting to get a group together to go and walk the PCT. And she was raising money. She was a type 1 diabetic. She was raising money for Diabetes UK. And I approached Frio and asked them whether I could speak to her. And they said, well, we can't give you her details, but we will let her know. And within 24 hours, she rang me or contacted me via the internet. And we arranged to have a phone conversation. And I thought, am I just living vicariously through this woman's dreams? As you said, she had been planning it for 2 years. And she was using one of those typical Cicerone guides that they have in the UK for great European trips, GR20 and the like. And she was busily working out her itinerary, how many miles she needed to do a day, and where her likely campsites would be, most of them being wild campsites. So she had done a lot of the logistical stuff. And then when I asked her about this hike, she said her parents were a little bit worried about her because she was type 1, and it would really reassure them if another diabetic was there for support, could be there with her. And I got off the phone with my husband, and he said, "You're going to do it, aren't you?" I go, "Oh, no, I'm still thinking about it. I'm just doing my research." And I just got excited and enthralled with her enthusiasm. And I thought, this is meant to be. I have to do it. And she said, "I'll help you with everything. I've got most of the itinerary nearly complete. And in order to walk the Pacific Crest Trail and in order to protect this pristine landscape and make sure resupply towns are not inundated with heaps of hikers, particularly since the publication of Cheryl Strayed's Wild in 2015, there's now on average 4,000 to 6,000 people who get a permit annually. What they do is they limit the permits to 50 permits per day, leaving from the most southerly point being the town of Campo and generally heading northbound to the Canadian border. And so they open up 35 permits in October of the previous year to the year of your intended hike. People secure dates there. You don't want to be too early. People can start in March, but you run the risk when you get to the Sierra Nevada ranges in central California of having too much snow and it becoming a mountaineering expedition. So we were intending, Helen had secured a date, late April start date, and it was going to be a challenge for me to get the same date. So how the permit process works is you use several devices on the day that the permit process opens, be it an iPod, iPad, your desktop, and you log in and you get a place in the queue. So you can get several places in the queue with your devices. And with 35 permits of a maximum of 50 already having been allocated in October, the next round of offers opens on January the 10th of the year of your intended hike. And so Helen, my husband and I all logged in, and she's got a time difference, so she knew when January 10 at a certain time was in the UK, and we were doing it at the same time here, which I think was maybe 3 a.m. here in Australia. And we were getting 2,000th position in the queue, 3,000, and she got something like 700. So at that point, we knew that Helen was the one who's going to have the first dibs at applying for a permit on the same day as her departure date. So we left it with her, and Mike and I, my husband, we were, crossing our fingers with bated breath. All she needed to know was my name, my birth date, and a few facts that she had to put into the system. And she did it, and we got the same date, and that was that. After that was done.
I think that's probably the one of the biggest challenges. It's okay if you're going as a solo or you're booking two tickets at the same time, but doing it a number of months apart is a pretty amazing feat in itself.
Yeah, well, I don't know that you can do it as a group either. You have to do it individually. They're doing some modifications, but because the hike is generally done in a Novo northbound direction, it doesn't mean you can't do it in a southbound direction, but southbounders normally start in July after the snow has finished. And what the PCT Association, PCTA is what they call themselves, do, and they manage the permits, is they're now encouraging people to maybe go to the midpoint of the trail, which is the town of Chester, and head north to Canada. And you don't have the problems of the first snowfall hitting around October 1 and it becoming too dangerous to continue. And then via various transportation means, be it plane, train, car, bus, get back to Chester and then head southbound to Campo. And you may encounter lightning thunderstorms, which are fairly common in September in the High Sierra. You may avoid the typical fire season, and you'll be walking through the desert in cooler months. So it's a 6-month hike, generally speaking, and it's a race against time and the elements to get there.
Yeah. I think I must admit it's something that I'm keen to do, but I've been watching it over the last 8 years. And particularly the last few years, the fires seem to be the major issue of getting people off trail. That if you don't start early enough, you potentially get caught up in the fires. But then that brings the issue with the snow in the Sierras. So it's a one of those sort of things. I think when you live in the States and you can say, all right, I can always come back and finish it next year. It's a bit of an easier process to think about. But as an overseas traveller, having to say, right, I've got to now travel back overseas to the US and finish it off. So that
heightens the enthusiasm of it, though, Tim. The other thing I had to do before I got the permit, I had to do this. I had to get a USB2 tourist visa, which gives you 6 months in the States without having to leave it midway through. And I had to go through the process at the MLC Centre in Sydney CBD with all these guards, and they just make it so scary. And you've got to sound convincing when you have your interview and know what the PCT is. And once I went through that traumatic process, I easily got my visa, which was then valid for 5 years. And last year I travelled on that to complete a section I missed. And then after I had got my permit in January, I booked my airfare. So they are the key things: getting your visa, getting a permit, and booking your airfare. And the rest of it, you can almost wing it. But I didn't wing it. I did a lot of preparation in it. But having gone back a second time, whether I go back a third time, I'm not sure. I would like to hike in that area for as long as I can. I absolutely adore it. I'm just becoming more and more relaxed about it. I guess I know what to expect, and what to expect is the unexpected. Yeah. You can't plan for that. And so generally speaking, although Helen had a concise itinerary of what we would do day by day, she got crippling blisters on day 2. We had to have an extra night in a campsite, and, the itinerary just blew out and blew out and blew out and got modified horrendously, but in a fun way. There was lots of tensions aside and everything, but we found a way of walking a very long way.
Okay, now you said that Helen was walking northwards. That tends to be the traditional method that most people do. More and more, because of the ability to get spaces on the right day, a lot of people are starting to head south. And that heading south in itself does tend to shorten your window. But was there any reason that Helen chose north as opposed to heading south?
I think the hiker culture of the Pacific Crest Trail is that you do it in a northerly direction. It's the done thing. It doesn't mean it's the right thing, or it's no better. I mean, we ended up walking northbound and southbound, and they're both as enjoyable experiences. You get as much elevation going one way as the other. It's up and down all the time. I think it's just a cultural thing that you do it northbound.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned to you just then, it's changing because if it continues to become more popular, the towns that you meet along the way, and many of them you do have to hitch to get to, because they're not just off the trailhead. They can't sustain or support a large number of hikers at any one time.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the key logistical considerations, but as you mentioned, both you and Helen are type 1 diabetics. What additional challenges did that present? I mean, and you've mentioned already keeping the insulin at the right temperature, but what else did that force into your planning, into your actual walking on the trail?
A large reliance on trail angels. So we kept our insulin safe while we were hiking, but insulin is only stable for up to a month out of the fridge. So we needed trail angels who had refrigerators where they could store our insulin. We also used continuous glucose monitors for testing our blood glucose levels, and their devices, it's like a 20-cent piece that you stick on the back of your arm, because that's an area of your body that doesn't tend to get knocked as much. And they can fail, but they only last 14 days. So I can't, from a weight perspective with our backpack weight, I can't carry heaps of consumables. So we left some of those with trail angels when we sent them our insulin.
And did you find that any stage through the walk that you had to stop what you were doing or take a break because your insulin levels were getting a bit too out of kilter?
No, I mean, if our insulin got dangerously low, we, for safety's sake, diabetics would maybe have a glucogen pen on them, which I guess because I was walking with a partner at the time, the other person, if you'd fallen unconscious or something, would inject into you and give you a sugar hit. For us, that was just another unnecessary piece of equipment we needed to carry. We were going to be vigilant about how we managed our sugars. We had heaps of hypo treatments. So hypoglycemia is low blood glucose levels. Your energy just plummets. It's like the gas in the tank of your car has gone. You need to get to a petrol station and you need to treat it with food or you can't function or continue walking. So one of the complications that we did have was that we didn't realise, but high altitude hiking tends to plummet your blood glucose levels more than you would normally experience. And so we had to reduce our daily insulin doses significantly. And we were both on multiple daily injections. We weren't on pump technology. And what we would do, we were 5 injections a day. So we have 2 long-acting injections, one for the morning, one for the evening, that lasts 12 hours. And then we would inject for breakfast, lunch and dinner. But the actual dosage that we were doing was half what we would normally have in our normal sedentary life. And when we were at high altitude, we had to drop it even more.
Okay. Now, in your book, you mentioned that you had to be very focused on gear. So what gear changes did you make for this trip? Did you have a lot of the gear already, or did you need to find you having to change out for both the distance of the trip you were doing and the issue of carrying things like beer canisters?
I guess those fundraising walks that I explained to you I had done, and even the Kokoda, I wasn't really carrying much gear. So I was staying in B&Bs. I had a suitcase which luggage providers would move from B&B to B&B. So I wasn't camping per se. And this was a whole new ball game. So I wouldn't say I necessarily like camping, but I do talk about it a lot with my husband, and I can see his eyes glaze over when I talk to him about every little nuance of it. But yes, when I made the decision to do this, and my husband could understand, why I wanted to do it and everything. It was a delight to test out all the gear and work out what I was going to take. And yes, I had lots of failures, and lots of things didn't actually make it into my pack. I wanted an ultralight backpack. Most of them were made by Cottage Industries in the States. I couldn't see them. I had to rely on the data that they provided on their website, and invariably they got sent to me. I'd paid a fair bit of money for them, and they didn't fit me. So I sell a lot of my gear on Gear Freak Australia with great success, and it's not because the gear's not good, it just hasn't worked for me. So buy a branded ultralight backpack to start off with, and I could barely walk on my local fire trail, bush track, without being in total agony. I was taking all the weight on my shoulders, and I knew it wasn't going to work. In the end, we were regularly carrying 20 kilos. I mean, we had to carry a beer canister for a lot of it, and that was a minimum of that was another kilo, bulky, hard container, which doesn't stop the bears smelling what's inside it, but it's a deterrent from them actually getting to your food.
Now, the other thing you mentioned as well is, you left your husband behind pretty much for 6 months. What was his view on that, and what was your view on that?
More to the point, I was leaving MS at home.
Yeah.
Now, he can still get around with the aid of a walking stick, but many people don't see the multitude of invisible symptoms he had. I needed a break from it occasionally, and a hard hike for me is where I can focus on myself with an activity I seek and cherish. And then he was most understanding and encouraging. And I always reassure him that I'll come back. And but for him, unfortunately, the rest strategy that he uses to manage his condition is the direct opposite of what I need for diabetes. I need to move regularly and often.
Yeah.
And he understands my condition's different management approach. And so although we try and do activities we both enjoy, I can't just sit in a sedentary way all the time. I have to complement it with more active pursuits. So if I'm personally going to continue living a long and healthy life, I mean, as Mike said, his MS, the quality of life can be significantly impacted, but new immunotherapy drugs now are making it easier and easier and improving their quality of life. But the complications of poor diabetic management are quite catastrophic. So I have to be selfish.
No, that's fair enough. And I think it's not a bad thing. I think any successful marriage, you've got to have something that's your own, and you don't have to spend every waking minute with each other, and it's good to have a break from time to time. So,
yes.
And I must admit, my wife's very much the same as well. She's quite happy when I go away. It gives her a bit of peace and quiet. So it's giving the other person a chance to do exactly what they want to do without having to think about what their partner wants at the same time. So.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely love hiking and long-distance hiking. And if I hadn't have developed diabetes, I may never have pursued this pastime.
What did you end up doing with your phone? Did you just get a new SIM card or a new phone over there, or did you just get a roaming service on your Australian phone?
No, I didn't. When I did it in 2019, it costs about $40 a month for you to get a new SIM card, and I used AT&T, and Verizon's the other most popular one, but AT&T supposedly has more coverage on the trail.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful. I mean, we could book motels if we needed a day for resupply. We needed a much-needed shower. We needed to recharge our devices. We just had to, look after ourselves. We could ring. And I could order, products with REI over the phone and things like that.
Okay. And what about food resupply? I mean, did you, obviously Helen had been planning this for a while, so had she already set up the resupply points and you just needed to do your own, or was that something that you still had to manage and work out where you were going to send food boxes from and to?
What I do, I'm now on my third book. It's the same book. It hasn't. It's the 6th edition. It hasn't changed much. Is I use the Pacific Crest Trail data book, and it basically helps you work out your mileage. It starts at mile 0, Campo. It's in a northbound direction. When I walked last year in a southbound direction, I just had to work backwards. And in it, it's got lots of useful information about resupply points, where you can resupply to, and the postal addresses for those resupplies. So you send everything general delivery to yourself. You go to the local post office, you get a cardboard box, normally a medium-sized one, for a set fee, and you just fill it with as heavily as you want. You seal it well. You put PCT hiker on it, you put an ETA on it when you're likely to arrive at that point. You decorate it with unicorn stickers, so when you get to the post office you can say, it's got unicorn stickers all over it, so they're not saying, I can't find it. And so I had a bit of fun with all of that. But yes, I did, when I got to the States, I did some resupply for some key towns where there wasn't adequate supermarkets or that or choice in the food that I might like to eat, and I sent it on to myself. I also maintained a bounce box, which is a box of supplies. Like it might have had some diabetic consumables, it might have had sunscreen or specialist sunscreen I wanted, or a change of socks and everything, and I would bounce that along to towns I was likely to get to. I had to also be careful with the resupply. I mean, this is where some planning is. Sometimes you can send your resupply to a hotel, motel, a business, and it doesn't matter when you arrive. Say if you arrived on a weekend, But if you arrive on a Saturday and the post office is closed, you're stuck there till Monday until you can retrieve your resupply. So some people would say, well, why bother sending a resupply? There's a gas station. You really can get all you need there. You only need... See, what we did as hikers is, irrespective of the fact we shouldn't be eating sugary products, is we wanted calorie-dense, lightweight food.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of rubbish food you find in gas stations, petrol stations. And so you could arrive in a town on a Saturday, go to the gas station, get your resupply, and you could be out the next morning or that night. So the other thing is some of the resorts or businesses who were trying to, nurture and grow their support for the PCT community, the PCT hiker community, is they would allow resupplies to be sent to them, but often it was not through the USPS, US Postal Service. It was through UPS or FedEx. And so I could send something there for me to pick up, but they're not a post office, so they wouldn't send something out. So sending a bounce box to a business that was only receipting goods, that was the end of the bounce box. I had to empty it and carry the stuff with me.
Yeah.
So there was that logistical challenge, but I found that fun.
Okay, now one of the things that resonates with me is in your book you mention your husband's comment of, I just can't see the appeal of long-distance hiking. Now, several of my family members and friends have said the exact same thing to me. What is it you love about long-distance hiking and what makes it so special for you?
Well, one, it's less of a hassle than doing an overnighter or a 2 to 3 day multi-hike. A very long hike, it takes the same amount of effort, and the only difference is the amount of food and water you're carrying. So I would rather hike for 100 days and do a massive cleanup afterwards when I wash and stow all my gear than do it multiple times after every overnighter.
Yeah.
The other thing people don't get is that the thrill of long-distance hiking doesn't kick in until after 5-7 days. And most people never get to that. They never know that thrill of being immersed in nature, free, energized, alive, far from, all our everyday stresses and trials. So yes, it's an adrenaline kick. I don't think it's like any extreme sport. There's things that come when you continue. And, I'm now really enjoying solo hiking. Never feel alone. I don't feel lonely. I like my own company and I can handle it, being alone for lengthy periods of time. And my constant chatter with other hikers that pass by might indicate I do like company, but I can manage alone.
I was going to say, we've touched on gear briefly, but what were your big three? Your pack, your sleeping bag, and your tent. What did you end up using?
I was briefly looking at your website, and I know you're a bit of a gear freak as well. And I've seen some of the items that you use, and some of them I use as well. So I started this hike with an Osprey Zena 70, and I removed the brain, left that at home. So the capacity was reduced to about 60 litres. It had heaps of straps, pockets for securing things, and it appealed to me for my love of organisation because for that reason. And so whenever I put things in certain pockets, I kept the same thing in that same pocket, so I always knew where it was. But by today's standards, it's a heavy pack. It carries a heavy weight really well, but it's 2.5 kilos of pack alone. Yeah. I've transitioned to a Dan Durston, a Kakwa 55 at the moment, which I also like. I've got one of the originals in this new series of packs that he's making, and its exterior pocket is too small. So I've done some modifications with shock cord and carabiners to increase that carrying capacity. But of course, with the ultralights, you've got lots of things hanging all off your pack, and I like my pack being quite neat. But it's only 1 kilo in weight, so I've shed 1.5 kilos, and it is carrying a heavy weight really comfortably. Unfortunately, the thing that I have to control is then I can then add in another 1.5 kilos and not gain anything by the process.
Yeah. It's a hard thing to, I think people will traditionally, if they've got space, they'll fill it up with something. But if you give them a smaller pack, quite often they're quite comfortable and happy with it. So.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I left the brain off that Osprey pack because I knew I'd fill it. For my tent, I chose the non-freestanding 2-person Z-Pack duplex. It's a dream 3-season single-wall Dyneema tent. And as a woman who didn't have much camping experience, I could assemble that tent with minimal fuss using my trekking poles. I could get a really good pitch every time. I could even pitch in a slight trench, wake up in a pond, and be completely dry.
That's always an important thing, isn't it? Sometimes you think you're on dead flat ground, but it takes a bit of rain to show you whether you are or not. Yeah,
and my partner was just a little bit away from me, and she was not in a puddle. And then, and I could also have dreadful condensation with these single wall tents. So some nights, if I camp near a stream or in the open, as long as I didn't touch the walls of the tent with my sleeping bag, the wetness just runs down the tent wall, out the mesh to the exterior of the tent. And so what I give it in the morning is a quick chamois wipe down in the morning, and I just open one of the vestibules. I've got 2 vestibules, and just squeeze it out, and it's ready to pack up. It adds no weight because it doesn't absorb moisture like the nylon tents.
Yeah. I've had that happen a few times.
So if it was still slightly damp when I packed up, it would take no more than 10 minutes in the sunshine at lunch to dry it completely. And it was an absolute palace and served me well, weighing under 600 grams. As an older hiker's perspective, last year I transitioned to the Dandursten X-Mid Pro 2, which is also a Dyneema single-wall tent, but it has a sill nylon floor, which I wasn't as enthusiastic about. They now have a Dyneema version. Now, it's equally lightweight, and it's got some wonderful enhancements with the zip closure and the trekking poles offset, so you've got easier access and a phenomenal inside space, particularly the headroom. It takes a bit of practice to learn how to pitch it because the sleeping quarters are diagonal to the exterior pitch. Sort of a parallelogram, I think is how you describe it.
Yep.
But then my jerky arthritic hands had trouble with the zips with the tightly tensioned trekking pole tent that I'm used to. Maybe I tensioned it too tight and the zips failed. Dandursten covered it and repaired them under warranty, but I sold that tent because I thought I'm going to, with my hands are never going to improve, I'm going to ruin it again through no fault of my own. So Z-Pack introduced a duplex zip version to compete with the growing popularity of the Dandursten tents. And I could have gone back to the original and tried theirs, but I've got a brand new original tent, which it has simple toggle closure on the vestibules, and it's got no zips, and it's called a 2-person Z-Pack Duplex Classic.
Yeah. And
that's what I've gone back to for that reason. And then finally, my sleep system that you asked about, well, all about the R value. I see that you use a Thermarest, the grey, heavier one. I find it too bulky.
Yep.
I don't need that R value, but you might need it near the Australian slopes. So I have the Thermarest Neo Air Extra Light women's, which they now don't call the women's. They've replaced the valve, and I've now got the next regular, which is exactly the same as the women's, and I think it's got a slightly improved R value, but around the 4.7 mark, and I complement that with a Cedar Summit Aeros Premium inflatable pillow, and I put a buff over that as a pillowcase. And so in the X-Mid tent where you've got the sill nylon floor, those Thermarest sleeping pads can slip a bit. So I put a 3mm thick foam pad underneath it, and it stops it slipping. And you can then use that foam pad to sit on as your sit pad during the day as well. And you can cut it down. You can get bigger pieces, or you don't need a huge amount. It's very lightweight.
All right. And sorry, and the sleeping bag?
Oh, a sleeping bag of choice is a Z-Pack 30 Fahrenheit, which goes to -1 Celsius. A classic sleeping bag. So it's not a quilt. It's effectively, it's got a sewn-in toe box. It zips up, but it doesn't have a head on it. So you wear a hooded base layer or a buff and beanie, and it only weighs about 350 grams.
Now, in relation to navigation, was navigation an issue? And I believe most people tend to use something like far out guides. What were you using on the trail?
Yeah, exactly that. It was known as gut hooks back then, based on the creator's trail name. But you now know it as far out, and it's a very useful app for groomed trails. So I particularly like the real time interaction with other hikers, and I paired that with a Garmin InReach Mini. So for safety, and with that comfort of that big orange SOS button, you can activate if you ever get into serious trouble. That's assuming the device is in easy reach and it's not making its way down a raging stream attached to your backpack and without you in it.
Okay, now you mentioned water there, but we'll go on to raging rivers in a few minutes. What did you do to manage your water filtration on trail?
I used the largest standard Sawyer squeeze filtration system at the time, not the Mini. Mini's fairly unreliable. I paired that with a NOC Vecto 2-litre reservoir, so it's spelled CNOC. It's got a really wide mouth opening for easy water collection. And in towns, I'd backwash the Sawyer squeeze, or I'd wrap it hard on the side of the sink, whack on the porcelain sink in a hostel to dislodge any of the accumulated debris. I found the squeeze. You turn your reservoir upside down and you squeeze that, the water in the reservoir through the squeeze into a clean 1 litre tall, skinny, sufficiently durable smart water bottle. The brand they have here, which I haven't seen in the supermarkets recently, is Cleanse. Same shape bottle with a 28 ml thread. So yes, my smart water bottles, I had 2 1 litre smart water bottles. They always had clean water in them, filtered that way. And but I found the filtering with the Sawyer squeeze slow. So I have actually migrated to the Platypus quick draw filter.
Yeah.
Which is a similar thing, but it filters very quickly. Juries fill out because that flow may stall if it gets caught with debris. And although you can shake it with, say, a smart water bottle in a horizontal position in the field, I'm not sure I get that much debris out of it when I'm giving it a good wrap when I'm at home. So
Okay.
I do like it though.
Okay. Now, trail names are a big thing on the US long-distance hiking circuit. What was your trail name and how did you get it? And what did Helen end up being called?
All right. Well, trail names are a really fun way of connecting with other hikers, and they also provide you with some privacy and a sense of safety because people don't really know who you are. Surprisingly, people remember trail names more easily than your real one anyway, and there were many foreigners with names not easily remembered or pronounced correctly. So my PCT trail last year, I met Weather Girl, who obviously had a focus on knowing what the weather was. I only learned her real name when I saw her resupply arrive at the desk and I was standing right beside her. And another one was Two Cups, who basically couldn't get going in the morning without 2 cups of coffee. And I had no trouble calling Weather Girl and Two Cups by those names. And so the trail name that was given to me was not generally those names are given to you by another person, usually a hiker, but it was given to me by a friend from back home. And the other thing about trail names is you don't have to accept a trail name. Often it's given to you for something stupid that you've done and you may feel a bit embarrassed about it. I met one bloke who had extremely, he was extremely long legs, and he was called Legs, and he didn't really like that. So you don't have to accept the suggestions, but you'll come to a point where you like one. And so someone suggested Kit Kat to me, and she said it was an abbreviated form of Killing It Katrina. And I found it quite ironic because I felt at times on the trail I wasn't killing it at all. And a diabetic really shouldn't eat too many of that popular chocolate bar, or you risk high blood glucose levels. But, you know, if I was having a hypo, it was a great snack to raise my blood sugar levels. So I embraced the name. I gave Helen the name Shepherd because she had a lot of outdoor experience. She'd done the scout route and all that Girl Guide route when she was young, which I had never done. And she knew how to tie knots and all the like. And she enjoyed being in front, leading me. And I enjoyed photography. So I enjoyed being at the back. And I effectively became her flock. And finally, we had a joint trail name. It was perfectly suited to us because we were well endowed compared to a lot of the younger hikers. And it was more a reference to our diabetic condition, and we were known as the Double Ds. So many a laugh was had when we told other hikers our joint name, and it was like telling a fart joke. So it was a good introduction. So, yeah, people would see us along the trail many months later or weeks later and go, oh, they're Double Ds.
Yeah, it seems to be, as you say, in some respects, it's easier to remember a trail name, whereas if you just Sue or Bill or something like that, you don't tend to remember those sort of names.
No, they're sort of ordinary names, and, you know, which Bill? Oh, didn't we see which? It gives you a bit of colour.
Okay, now, what challenges did you have on this journey? What were the key challenges?
Key challenges, all right. So I gave the PCT a new name, the Problem Constantly Solving Trail. It never disappointed. Just as you overcame the heat, you get a new weather event, descending on your freezing wind, snow in late May, totally unexpected as summer approached. Snow in the High Sierra, requiring mountaineering skills we didn't have. Resupply food not arriving on time, forcing Helen and I to separate for a few days. When we were in Oregon, as one of us had hers, which was me, and the other did not have her food and she refused to leave. The dry conditions for us both coming from humid climates, wet for Helen, and I guess I could say wet for Sydney, but we were sort of, I was going to say more humid for Sydney, and we would just get these deep fissures around our fingernails because we weren't used to such dry air. And basically we had to, with a suggestion from another hiker that passed by us, we filled those gaps with super glue frequently. The only thing that helped keep them together, because they were deep cracks and it was quite painful. Of course, we had blisters, and then I had a momentous injury in Washington State where I tore my plantar fascia and we had to get off trail. And as I was hobbling along and Helen was getting weary and she went ahead of me, I said, just go ahead, we'll work this out. I couldn't lift my foot properly and I just face planted into the hard path and I gave myself a really bad black eye. And then I continued to walk the trail up and I'm thinking, oh, this is miserable. And I was expecting Helen to be at the top, sort of encouraging, you can do it, Katrina, you can do it, knowing I'd had the injury. But no, she was fighting her own battles. Yes, there were physical aches and pains, but the emotional, mental strength constantly tested us as we tired. And, and we started questioning our ability and determination to continue when, if people read the book, they'll find out why we didn't finish the hike and why we couldn't finish the hike. And, as one major tough ascent looked pretty similar to the last one and we had 10 more to go, we had to seriously question why were we doing this, had the fun, the passion had left us.
Okay, now that brings us on to the next thing. You ended up what's known as a flip-flop, where you jumped ahead to the end of the trail and started walking south. You gave a bit of a brief introduction into that, but how did this happen? And did you end up finishing, or did you fall short of completing the whole track in 2019?
Okay, so our intention was to ascend Mount Whitney, which is the highest mountain in contiguous USA outside of Alaska, at 14,494 feet, which is nearly 4,500 metres. So it's pretty high. And we happened to pass this fellow gung-ho capable hiker retreating to the town of Lone Pine, where we had just come from. And we just said to him, well, why are you turning around? What's up? He goes, oh, one of our tramley. Our tramley is sort of a group of hikers. They call it, it's short for trail family. And one of their tramley members, who had a trail name of Speedy, slipped off an ice chute ascending Mount Whitney. And he was paralysed, in a state of panic and shock as he held on to his life on a small rock ledge. And his hiking mates stayed with him for several hours, this guy being one of them, and they ended up using ice axes and to assist and coax him off the precarious ledge. So they didn't need to activate an SOS button. He did retreat from the trail, and of course that was the end of his trail, but it shocked everyone, and they were retreating. So when he told us that story, we went, geez. We became shocked too. And we had to sort of assess, was this just fear-mongering? Sometimes people like doing that because they sort of don't have the guts to do these adventurous things themselves, so they make the story bigger. But we had seen this gentleman, this younger hiker, many times before, and he seemed highly capable, and it was disconcerting that he was retreating. So I thought to myself, with Speedy, the hiker who got into strife, perhaps going a little too fast. That's why he had his trail name, and maybe he could have avoided that accident. Or, we were hiking in a year where the snowpack was 220% higher than a normal winter snowfall.
Yeah.
So was this hike getting beyond our comfort level? And we had a 7-day food carry, wash. So we worked all this out. What if we missed Mount Whitney and continued on? So we thought, yeah, we'll do that. That will alleviate this problem. So were there any other possible impassable sections? And the next one was Forester Pass. And Forester Pass is the highest point on the PCT. So that's at over 13,000 feet, over 4,000 metres. And that was our next major pass. We had to ask ourselves, what if we had to retreat from that due to high snow further along? At that point, there were very few safe exit points in this remote wilderness. And if we ran out of food as diabetics, we'd be putting our lives at risk. So it wasn't worth losing our lives over. We had loved ones back home. They were relying on us to be sensible. And we had to decide at Rock Creek regarding these next 5 days. And so we chose to retreat and regroup. It was very traumatic, very traumatic. I think Helen wanted to quit at that point. I said, we can't quit. Maybe we could have changed our airfares once. We had flexible airfares, but I think once you've changed them once, you can't do it again without major cost involved. So we finally retreated to Lone Pine. We got a lift up to a larger town called Bishop, and we stayed at the Hostel, California. And we were met by the friendly host there, who was an avid hiker himself. And he advised us that the snow in the most northerly part of this walk was well below normal levels, and it was safe to head as far north as possible and continue our hike southbound. And that's why we flipped.
Okay. And it's an interesting thing, because a lot of people say, "Oh, you're not doing the hike properly if you don't do it all in one direction." But I think, as I mentioned previously, the weather conditions, the fire, they all can have impacts, and sometimes it's the safe and the sensible thing to do.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is, people say, "Oh, a true through hike is if you go in a continuous direction." But if you cover the same mileage in the same summer season, you've done it. Yeah. And finding ways to do it with all these sort of climate issues like fires and impassable sections and detours. It's just part of the growing process. So, yes, we fell short. We ran out of time. We couldn't sustain the hefty 20-mile days that were required to finish. We were fatiguing, and emotionally and mentally it was becoming harder to keep the passion going. When the goal to complete the PCT in a single calendar year was beyond us, as funds and the time allowed in the States dwindled, with us only having 6-month visas.
Yeah.
So we couldn't stay there forever. I didn't really want to go to a consulate and ask. I think you can get extensions, but didn't want to go through that.
No.
So the end result was we had 4.5 months on the trail together, followed by a 2-week holiday, 1 week in San Fran and 1 week in LA, as we awaited our final departure date, having already changed our dates once before. So we completed 2,518 kilometres, and according to me, about 150 kilometres more than that, which Helen and other hikers said I couldn't include because they weren't true PCT miles, even though they were part of the official trail. So, for example, we went to the most northerly point. We got various modes of transport to get to Harts Pass. Trail Angel got us up this very precarious road to Harts Pass, and we had to walk for 3 days to get to the Canadian border, touch it, and then walk back. So normally if you were doing it in a northerly direction, you wouldn't do that 3-day hike back.
Yeah.
And I said, but we were on the PCT, so yeah. So we covered 2,655 kilometres in total.
All right.
And we walked approximately 24 Ks a day.
All right. And how many days was that in total walking?
I can't remember. It was maybe 110, I can't remember.
What were the highlights of the trip for you?
Well, a huge highlight was hiking with Shepherd. She was a determined, energetic diabetic like me, and she was committed to following her dream. I think she tired a little bit more than me at the end, but it was understandable. She was a stoic Brit, and I think her blisters and foot problems were far worse than she cared to admit. So I think fatigue got her in the end. It was also meeting so many like-minded individuals and finding connection with them, despite our age differences. So essentially lots of 30-year-olds who just completed their university education and retirees. So, and the unexpected joy that we felt when the PCT provided, it did throw a lot of problems at us, but, the joy was trail angels, these generous individuals or past hikers who were paying forward to us because they had been treated kindly. And from the kindness of their heart, there are people who ask for money, but they don't. They're running a business. But the ones who are doing it from the kindness of the heart, they just want to hear your stories. And they offer you food on the trail. They maintain water caches in the desert where the water sources are scarce. They offer their yard or a bed to pitch your tent and lay your weary head. And they ferry you from the trailheads to the resupply towns and back again.
Okay.
So the kindness of strangers and the generosity of the American people was a gift so unexpected. And look, it makes me want to return to this wonderful country, which in my opinion offers some of the most majestic grand scale scenery I have ever witnessed. The desert.
I was going to say, I must admit, I've got a love of big conifer forests, and really that's either Europe or the US. So I don't know if I'll ever get to do the PCT, but it's certainly still on my list of things I want to do.
The only thing I would remind you, as you said, with the PCT, it is a lot of conifer forests, which means there's a lot of sap, fir sap on the ground you can't see. So unless you use a sit pad, you get quite a sticky bum.
Yeah.
Which you've then got to use some solvent when you're washing to get off. But, but the thing is, you're talking about conifers, and even sort of small pinyon forests were beautiful, but the desert was so unlike what I expected. It's harsh and dry, but the magnificent ridgelines you're walking on and looking down on beaver tail cactus, I love the hot pink ones, and the towering yuccas, which are now quite popular in Australia in landscape gardens, and the sort of scary Joshua trees when we at one point we had to walk the waterless Californian aqueduct at night because you can hear the water, but you can't access it. It's the water source from the Sierras that goes through to LA.
Yeah.
And that was quite an experience. But, with our head torches shining on Joshua trees, they were quite a scary tree. And then the Sierras in Central California, the homeland of John Muir country, this is a special place where this famous naturalist and conservationist successfully preserved for future generations. And Oregon's got, once again, very pleasant conifer forests. It's got lakes galore, with the Jewel being Crater Lake, which we saw, deepest and bluest of all as a result of volcanic activity. And then there's Mount Jefferson, Three-Fingered Jack, the Three Sisters, and Mount Hood. And then as you migrate north, Washington's similar to Oregon, but it has much higher elevation, not as high as the Sierras. It's got cooler, wetter weather, and I felt more chance of wildlife there. And then a wonderful selection of edible berries, thimble, black, blue, and huckleberries. And then absolutely awe-inspiring Goats Rock wilderness, shadowed by the lovely Mount Rainier in the background. So add in the multitude of people you meet, and you've got an unforgettable experience that will sustain you for many years to come. I wake up to the PCT every day. I loved it. And although I lost my job, they were not prepared to give me leave without pay. And maybe I ended up retiring earlier than I wanted to. I will never regret this spur of the moment decision to walk this.
Okay, now you've already mentioned a few of them, but what about the lowlights? And you did mention previously in your book about post-hike depression. Was that an issue for you at the end of this hike?
Yes and no. So, yes, we've gone through the logistical challenges and the sore blistered feet, and the torn plantar fascia and the black eye. But I have to say, 6 months down the track, those bad memories, you simply leave your mind. It's got this incredible healing ability to remember only the good times and erase those bad memories, which why I guess it prompted me to head back to the PCT in 2023. And I had, in some ways, quite a horrendous, difficult hike, but and I said never again, and I've completely forgotten those traumas as well. So if we talk about post-hike depression, I think essentially the better a hike, the longer that hike, very real possibility you will experience it. And I have on those previous fundraising walks before, because I get in the groove. I like the long distance. I don't want it to end. I've gone through all the planning and the execution and the adjustments to keep myself on the trail. And it's been all consuming. And then it just abruptly finishes in part or whole. And you start questioning your whole purpose in life again. What am I going to do now? How do I keep in contact with all those friends who live so far away from me? Will I ever see them again? Is anyone back home even interested in what I achieved? No, not really. The length and complexity of long distance hiking is beyond their comprehension. Even family members show very little interest.
Yeah.
And it's this point that you need to pick yourself back up, decide on a new project, start planning how you're going to do another great through hike. So I took up art. There was a scarlet paintbrush wildflower. I still haven't quite done it because I want to do a good job, but that was Helen's favourite flower, and I wanted to learn how to paint it. So I took up art. I'm learning watercolour. As you've read some of it, I have wrote about my 2019 PCT, called it Infinite Raspberry. A shout out to the lipstick I wore every day. Gave me colour to my face. It gave me sun protection, made me look half decent in a selfie. And it was sort of a shout out to women, if you want to wear makeup, do your own thing. It is possible. And raspberry sort of rhyming, Cockney rhyming slang for fart. And, when you're walking at elevation in the Sierra Nevada, that's what you do. These activities have kept the depression at bay for me this time. But if people are listening to our podcast today, I highly recommend those interested in walking the PCT to read Pacific Crest Trails. a psychological and emotional guide to successfully through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. It was written in 2016 by Zach Davis and Carly Morey, and it helps you learn how to cope with all its challenges. And 90% of what they say, how you cope, is coping with the mental ones.
Yeah,
and it's still available on Amazon in Kindle format or paperback.
Okay, now you were 58 when you started this hike, and I think you were 59 when you finished it. How did you find it in terms of fitness and the hiker culture?
I didn't find it a problem. Both Helen and I were fit and healthy. She was 9 years younger than me. Look, I loved interacting with the younger crowd, as I said, mostly in their early 30s, and the older retired hikers. In both these distinct age groups, I found fun, engaging, and equally motivated to complete the trail. So most of them were well prepared. And if not, they started slower, and that is the recommendation. So, and by slower, I mean no more than about 10 miles a day, 16 kilometres, and gradually you work yourself up to a regular 20 to 30 mile day. Your hiking legs will develop the longer you go. Older hikers could comfortably average 10 miles a day at higher elevation, as I experienced in the Sierra Nevada last year. I was doing a little bit more than that. And then you should be able to, as an older hiker, be able to manage 20 miles or even 30 in the flatter terrain of Oregon. So the younger ones, just from a comparison, were pulling about 30 to 40 mile days. Some of them were even doing like a 68 mile challenge. It's a thing that they do. And then I think they probably need 2 days off the trail to recover. So what that achieved, I don't know. But they were absolute machines. But they've got 30 less years than me and less kilos on them too. So it's to be expected that they can moto past me. And as many folks on the trail said to me, and you've said it many times on a lot of your other podcasts, is hike your own hike. And that is exactly what I did. There were several 70-year-olds I met on the trail. And they're just plugging all away at it nicely, taking frequent breaks, enjoying a couple with a view, offering wise advice, and just enjoying being out there amongst nature for as long as their physical bodies will allow. And that's what I hope to do.
Okay, now having done the trip in 2019 and then going back in 2023 to do another section, which we'll talk about in a moment, would you have done anything differently if you hiked this trail again?
Not really. All I would say is I wouldn't too much as you sort of have to go through the process of planning. That's all it is a process. Don't try and stick to a tight itinerary. Don't fret too much over the logistics and the resupply strategy. So planning is important, but it does come unhinged as early as day one. And it'll be what it'll be. You just got to let go of controlling the beast and run with it. And for me, freedom came when I was prepared to roll with whatever that PCT delivered to me, and personally enjoy the journey of discovery and growth. So it will take you on an adventure of your own choosing. It differs for everyone, but go with the flow and chill. Learn to adapt to the changing circumstances and just enjoy its unpredictability.
Okay, and one final question. You, as I said, you revisited the PCT almost by accident, I suppose, because in 2023 you were planning on doing the John Muir Trail. Couldn't get a permit for that, but you managed to work around by getting a PCT permit. Why did you do that, and how did that go?
Well, I really wanted to go back and do the PCT, but I really wanted to go back and see reputedly the most beautiful section of the trail, which is in the High Sierra region, which is effectively that section known as the John Muir Trail. So the John Muir Trail is 200 miles long. It starts in Little Yosemite Valley. The PCT doesn't go through that section, so there's a bit of a steep ascent to Lyle Creek Canyon area, and the PCT comes in at Tuolumne Meadows, and it parallels the John Muir Trail for 170 miles. of its 210-mile distance. And I thought to myself, well, yes, I want to go back and do that bit in particular. If I wanted to go back and do more of the PCT, I had to apply for a section hike, and it had to be a minimum of 500 miles. And I guess I was sort of querying whether I had it in me to do another 500 miles, another 800 kilometres. So I thought, let's just go for the John Muir Trail. This is the thing that's most important for you. Let's just do that. And I applied for 6 weeks to get a permit with all different access points and start dates. And I paid money to recreation.gov.au, and I was unsuccessful every week in their lottery system. And I just thought to myself, plan B. Well, why don't you walk another 330 miles so you can do the John Muir Trail? And that means you have to apply for a 500-mile PCT permit. And that's what I did, and I got it.
Yeah, I must admit, I've talked to a few people, and we've actually interviewed someone who did the John Muir Trail, and it's probably the hardest permit to get in the States, I think. Everybody wants to do it because, as you said, it's widely considered the best part of that area. So
when you're a PCT hiker, you can, like my intention was before we flipped, you can do a day trip up to Summit Mount Whitney, and then you have to return to Crabtree Meadow Campground. But if you have a JMT permit, you pass Crabtree Meadow and you can camp at Guitar Lake, which is pretty much at the base of Mount Whitney. I mean, it takes several hours to get there, but you're a lot closer to Mount Whitney. And then when you descend off the summit, you go down the 99 switchbacks down to down the Whitney portal route, and you're with a hitch, you're in Lone Pine before you know it. So I had done all the hike out of Kennedy Meadows South, northbound, towards the PCT route to access Mount Whitney. So on my PCT permit this year, I was not able to exit out at the portal route because it's not part of the PCT permit process. Yep. You have to get. And so I had to exit out Kearsarge Pass before for a resupply. So that's quite a hefty descent and ascent to get back on trail. It was necessary. And while I was down there, I had a brief excursion back into Lone Pine, and I was at one of the hiking stores, and I applied for an exit via the portal. So 2-3 days before I exited the PCT, I got a JMT permit to exit via the JMT portal. And I thought, I'm going to take it.
Yeah, I think
as it turned out, I did not on this occasion summit Mount Whitney either. I got caught. I was going for a dawn sunrise, and it's meant to be absolutely sensational. We checked the weather forecast. I consulted with another hiker. There was a 30% chance of maybe a little bit of rain, and I left at 3 a.m. in the morning, heard a little bit of thunder, and then when I got to the junction that would take me up to the summit of Mount Whitney, it was sleeting, freezing. I was wetting out. I was getting cold. I was thinking about an SOS, activating that Garmin, because I was a little bit out of my depth. And then it turned to snow, and I still had my micro spikes because of the high snow year. And I put them on. My fingers weren't working. I didn't experience one of the most amazing sunrises in my entire life, and my phone was wet. I couldn't activate it. I couldn't press the buttons. I was wet, and I managed clumsily to put my micro spikes on. By the time I was ready to put my backpack on my back, it looked like a snowman, and the track was disappearing before my eyes, and I knew that no one was going to come and rescue me because, one, I couldn't set up a shelter. I was on a very skinny trail. There was nowhere to set up a tent and take shelter. And it would have been treacherous. There was no light. dawn hadn't come. It seemed to be delayed because of this snow blizzard. And I was going to be hypothermic very, very soon. So what do? You move fast, you keep as warm as you can. And with the micro spikes on, I had traction and I ran for 40 minutes until I saw all these people at base camp, at the base of the portal, looking up at me and looking up at this inclement weather and thinking, should we summit today or leave it for another day? And I stumbled my way down to them, and I felt disoriented, and my thinking was, I guess, getting delayed. But I had made the right decision. I got out of danger. I survived. It was the last day on the trail. So I have not summited Mount Whitney yet, but I have my life. Great Walks magazine I wrote a story for them, and it's in their June-July edition this month about that descent from Mount Whitney.
All right. Well, that'll be interesting to read. And as this podcast comes out next week, which is into early July, it'll time out well.
Oh, thank you very much, Tim.
All right. So we've been talking with Katrina Hemingway about her journey on the Pacific Crest Trail. Katrina, thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my experience in episode 294 of your wonderful podcast series.
So that was our interview with hiker Katrina Hemingway on her trip on the Pacific Crest Trail. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, the main consideration for her, over and above other hikers having to deal with the complex logistics of this trail, was that both she and her hiking partner, who was known as Shepherd, both had type 1 diabetes. Now, I think for a lot of people, it's not a condition that I'm particularly familiar with, but you'd think that basically that here's a medical condition, it's going to impact on your life, it's going to stop you doing a lot of things. And really, from Katrina's point of view, it really didn't stop her doing anything. While this was certainly the longest hike she'd ever done, she'd done a number of long-distance hikes overseas and in Australia previously. And really, it's just a matter of planning in most cases. And probably the most complex thing for her and her hiking partner was where they leave the insulin supplies and being able to pick it up at appropriate times. But they certainly seem to have thought all that through and managed it quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you are living with a condition like that, it does become, just a normal part of what you need to think about. Obviously, hiking adds a layer of complexity and uncertainty. Hiking in another country then amplifies that. But, it's really, really good to see how she was able to do this and that she's willing to talk about it to guide other people. And, there's obviously information in the book that I think will be quite key for people who are interested in this.
And the book, it's really an online book on her website, and it's an enjoyable read. She has quite a good writing style, and so it was not just another. Oh yeah, this is another book on the PCT. It was actually quite.
We went here, we did this.
Yeah, so it really was worth reading, and it's free. So go onto the link in the show notes and read it because it is well worthwhile. In addition, as this podcast goes to air in July of 2024, she's also about to appear in one of Australia's hiking magazines, outdoor magazines. So you get to see a few more pictures and get a bit more of a feel for what she's talking about. A couple of other things that really resonated with me was that she mentioned in her book that she's an older hiker. Now, she started this hike when she was 58 and she finished it when she was 59, so roughly about 4.5 months on trail. And, she's older compared to probably the average person that does the Pacific Crest Trail. But this is one of these trails where people seem to do it when they're just out of school before they go to college, or they've just left college before they go to the real world and get a job. or they're retirees, with that middle batch of hikers that typically have family and family.
They've got too many other things to do.
Yeah. So, and she said she enjoyed interacting with people that were, in most cases, half her age, if not more. And it might be that she was a bit slower than the 20-somethings, but again, for someone her age, which we fall into that sort of category as well, she was doing good days and managing the trip quite well.
And the goal is to finish. Let's just remember that and enjoy it as you go. So speed's not a big thing, but it's good that she was able to keep up the pace.
The other comment that she made was that her husband said, "Why do you enjoy long distance hiking?" He just couldn't understand it, and that's probably a comment that Jill makes for me when I wanted to do the Bibbulmun track, as did a number of other family members as well.
Yeah, given I went to work because I thought that would be more fun.
So it's the sort of thing that for a lot of people, unless you are into long distance hiking, it's a hard thing to understand why people want to walk for months on end, covering hundreds, if not thousands of kilometres. But for those of us that do love long distance hiking, there's a real understanding of why we do this and why we want to do this for such a long period. Now, don't necessarily want to do it 52 weeks of the year, but doing long distance trails really is an enjoyable activity. Now, Katrina and her hiking, or Kit Kat as she was called on trail, and her hiking partner Shepherd, they did not finish this trail. There were a number of factors that impacted on what they ended up being able to do. Partly that was injury, partly that was the weather conditions. And I think she was saying at one stage that the snowpack through the snowies was around about 220% of average.
Wow.
So, if you're going to try and complete a through hike on the Pacific Crest Trail, starting in one direction and finishing in the other, that year was probably not the year to do it.
Yes, there are some windows that you have to meet. And if the weather does unseasonal things, it's all off.
And I think that's the thing. So in her case, they sort of had a bit of a stop and think and work out what they could do. And they ended up doing what's called a flip-flop. So they stopped, they got off trail, they headed to the Canadian border and started walking back towards where they'd come off because the snow in that part of the country was below average. So they managed to actually head from Canada downwards, and they didn't.
That would be south, Tim.
That would be south, yeah. And they didn't quite complete it. I think they ended up doing around about 1,604 miles all up, which is quite a big distance. So that's roughly about 2,000 odd kilometres, and that's pretty amazing for anybody. 4.5 months, a couple of thousand kilometres. It's an amazing sort of trip whether they completed it or not. And anyone that does a trip of that sort of length, for most people, it's going to be the longest trip they ever do. So Katrina ended up getting back on trail in 2023, and her aim was to try and complete the sections that she hadn't done before. And one of the things was she thought about what she could actually do, and the key thing that she missed was the John Muir Trail through the mountains, and this is often widely considered as the best trail in the States. It's a much shorter trail, and it parallels or takes in a good chunk of the Pacific Crest Trail, but there are some sections where it veers off and does its own thing. So she tried to get a permit to do the John Muir Trail, and we've interviewed someone in the past who's done that. This is probably the hardest trail to get a permit on in the States because it is considered as such a good trail. But what she ended up doing was getting a PCT permit, and to get a permit for the time she was looking at, all she had to do was saying that she was going to be completing 500 miles. So she ended up doing the bulk of the John Muir Trail, which again was a good section of the Pacific Crest Trail that she hadn't completed, and ended up having quite a good time. Although if you've listened all the way through, you realise it wasn't without its challenges as well.
Well, that was an interesting permit hack.
It is, and I think it's one of these things. A lot of people will end up doing that. If you want to be a purist and start at one end and finish at the other, it's going to be a bit of a harder thing to do, particularly when you're travelling from overseas. But I think if you want to do it without having to have as many issues from a permit point of view, getting that shorter Pacific Crest Trail permit is the way to go. Okay, so from my perspective, as I said, this is one of these trails that I would love to do, but I don't know if I ever will. Certainly from my perspective, I would love to do the John Muir Trail. And I think in listening to Katrina, it was a journey that was a bit different. It was a journey that has its own challenges, and it was a really interesting listen. So we hope you've enjoyed this interview with Katrina and her trip on the Pacific Crest Trail. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.